Chapter, the American Association for Public Opinion Research.
Woo!
Fitting that we should apply because it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the AAPOR relaunch event and to declare AAPOR officially back in business. I know it's a Friday night, and we weren't at all coy about the topic that we brought you here for tonight. So the fact that you're here makes you the ideal audience for this discussion, and exactly the kind of people we hope to engage in AAPOR events as we grow and develop. So over the next year or so, keep your eyes and ears open for more events. And if you have ideas about events, talk to one of the AAPOR board members whose names are cycling through on the slides. And also, please join AAPOR and volunteer. Talk to us if you want to volunteer, because we are completely a volunteer-driven organization, and we can very much use your help. But as for me, I am very excited about the possibilities offered by the newly relaunched AAPOR. AAPOR will serve as New England's leading organization of public opinion researchers, offering researchers a place to come together, and news media and consumers alike a place to come with questions about public opinion. And in the midst of an election cycle that will decide, among other things, control of the U.S. Senate, I can't think of a better time to talk about polling and hear from pollsters focused on the region's key races. To name just a few of the ticket-topping races, there are competitive races for governor in Maine and Massachusetts, as well as a Senate race in New Hampshire that some of you just might have heard about. And beyond that, there are a variety of competitive congressional elections and ballot questions and legislative elections, so plenty to talk about. It's a challenging time for polling, no doubt about it. Challenges we face include lower than ever response rates, the expense of calling cell phones, questions about non-probability methods, the internet, caller ID, poll unskewing, partisan polls, and the many other things that make being a pollster or a poll observer more complex than ever. But it's also an exciting time, because it's increasingly clear that the obstacles we face demand we explore more than one path. We're already moving down different paths, trying new things, and looking for ways around the obstacles that we face. But it's an uncomfortable position, to be sure. I'd much rather be able to choose a perfectly random sample of people, have them all respond to my survey, and simply report the results. I'd love it if respondents would cheerfully answer their listed landline telephone in the first ring and readily enumerate a full list of people living there, along with their correct birthdays. My ideal world has respondents who know all the candidates running in the races I'm interested in, know who they're going to vote for, and for sure whether they're going to vote or not. But that's not the world. Instead, pollsters are working to overcome the many challenges that the changing environment poses. And that's why organizations like AAPOR and organizations like AAPOR are more important today than ever. Working together, we'll continue to surmount the challenges of changing technology and the necessary changes in research practices that they require. The pollsters you'll hear from tonight are exemplary in both their integrity and the ingenuity they bring to their jobs, and that's perfectly suited to discuss these issues. So I'd encourage both the pollsters and non-pollsters in the room to use this opportunity to get your questions answered, both in the races they're focused on, but also what they see as the challenges and solutions ahead for polling. We'll begin tonight by hearing from Michael Link, the president of AAPOR. Following his remarks, we'll hear from our excellent panelists who will be introduced after we hear from Michael. So Michael Link is the current president of AAPOR and the chief methodologist for research methods at the Nielsen Company. He has a broad base of experience in survey research, academia, not-for-profit research, government, and the private sector. His research centers around developing methodologies for confronting some of the most pressing issues facing survey research, including techniques for improving survey participation and data quality, methodological issues involving the use of multiple modes of data collection, and obtaining participation from hard-to-survey populations. And his numerous research articles have appeared in public and other leading scientific journals. So please join me in welcoming Michael Link.
I can always tell when my mom sends in the bio. See, this was she's got an answer. There we go. How many from beginning? You can give a guy a job at Nielsen, but you can't teach him to use technology, right? So thank you very much. This is fantastic to be here. I actually live down in Atlanta, Georgia, so it's great to come up and hang out in Boston today. I had to be here because the launch of a new chapter and the fact that you guys all come together, wouldn't miss it. This is great that the fact that the group has gotten together after all these years, reconstituted, and from the national level, we want to congratulate all of the folks who did a lot of work over the last few years to really pull this together. And chapters are critical to the functioning of the national level association as well. I got my start at the Southern Association. And I can tell you, I've known folks like Rich and a number of others, and that's almost 25 years ago, and have maintained those friendships, maintained that collegiality. That's a group that I go to oftentimes because they're in my neighborhood, and I can drop in and we can talk about some of the things that are going on. And that happens with all of the chapters that we see in AAPOR. One of the things that I find interesting about chapters too is that a lot of people think that they're dictated by the national organization, but they're not. The really cool thing about AAPOR's chapters is they are grassroots. So it's a group of folks that get together with common interests and decide, you know what, we actually want to form a chapter and be able to have our own meetings and do those types of things. And so to me, that is truly a organic organization. And that's again why AAPOR has really prospered over the years. What's great is you have folks in here that probably are not members of the national chapter, but we also have people that are AAPOR members that are in the area that would be great if they became members of your chapter as well. So there's a great synergy that goes on between chapters and national. But the other thing that's important about chapters is it does give you those colleagues that you can call on. Let's face it, today is where you need help with friends. We're in a very trying time. Some might say, I actually look at it the reverse. I look at it as we have never lived in a time when people have more opportunity to express themselves. There are more ways to conceptualize public opinion today than there ever has been before. And there are more ways for us to measure public opinion before. So it really is, to me, a fascinating time for those of us that if you're on the methodology side, if you're on the insight side. We really are, I think, riding a wave. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I think that we are in a serious time of change, a paradigm change. Most of you probably, in school learned about about paradigm shifts, and one of the things about paradigm shifts is those that are living through them typically don't recognize it until years later. I think we're seeing the signs, though, of being in a paradigm shift in the sense that we had a fairly stable kind of world order in public opinion polling that we've seen over time now starting to erode. It's not going away, it's not going to completely crash, but it is certainly finding troubled waters these days. You've got some new approaches, very new approaches, and I'm not talking here about just the difference between probability and non-probability. I'm talking about some of the radically different types of ways of doing things, the big data types of things, social media types of things, very different ways of conceptualizing and measuring public opinion. Those are starting to come to the fore, but we don't know what the rules are. People are experimenting with these things. We don't exactly know how to turn those oftentimes into insights on a continual basis. We have some great instances of success, and I have no doubt that as folks continue to work in those areas, we'll see more of that. So you do have this clash, and we see this going on in our industry as well, as folks that were kind of raised on one side and folks that are coming up on the other side now, clashing. And most of the people, quite honestly, most of the AAPOR members, our members in here, are stuck in the middle. Really wanting to know, what do I do? What is it that, if I'm out there and I'm trying to produce public opinion or measuring attitudes or looking at behaviors, how is it that I know that what I'm putting out is fundamentally right? Or if I'm consuming some type of information about attitudes, how do I know that it's right? And I think that's the fundamental question that we really need to start looking at. We got to get out of this probability, non-probability, yes, no, black, white, 0, 1. Type of approach. That's not doing us any good anymore. We fought that fight, both sides, and it doesn't get us anywhere. The real question, I think, does get back to how do we have a reasonable expectation to know when we are correct? Whether we're putting out data or whether we are consuming data, that to me is one of the key things that's driving us. Well, AAPOR, hopefully you have seen, we're in the process of collecting abstracts for the conference that's coming up next May. And one of the things that council did this year is to help build on some of the work that has been going on with previous councils and really help us looking at this issue of how do we know that we're right. We've had a series of task forces over the years, probability online, emerging technologies that have kind of been building to this, where we've developed kind of a base understanding of where some of these issues are. We've developed this new task force, the Reassessing Today's Survey Methods Task Force, to come in May and help us to assess how do we navigate in this new world, primarily looking at surveys. They're not looking at big data, but I will tell you we also have another task force that's already looking at big data. So in May, we'll be able to look at both types of things, kind of where the survey world is regardless of the type of sampling you use, and then looking at big data as well. Another big thing that's going on in AAPOR that you have seen, hopefully, is the launch of the Transparency Initiative. Transparency Initiative being those pollsters that are out there, survey organizations that would like to publicly go forward and document some of the work that they have done according to the AAPOR code, can be part of the Transparency Initiative, and then they get the seal that they can use on their websites or other areas that they want. This becomes important because I think transparency is really the key standard that we should be looking at in this new world. Again, we've been criticized at some point. Some folks have written on blogs that, oh, if you're a standards organization, then you're anti-innovation. Well, that's just baloney. The two things can certainly do live together. And AAPOR is a great example. I'm sure in this room, we have individuals whose job day in, day out and passion is to push the envelope, to find new types of ways of again, conceptualizing and measuring public opinion. We have those people in AAPOR. The SurveyMonkey people, those people are AAPOR members that are doing that work. The NBC people working with them are AAPOR members. They are out there pushing the edge. We also, though, have individuals then whose day jobs is to produce data. And again, they would like to adopt new methodologies, but they need essentially a rule book. They need to understand what are the best practices, what are the rules by which these new methods can be used. And that's where I see, again, standards coming into play at two levels. I think at one level, we have kind of base standards being everybody should be transparent with what they're doing. You know, the basis of science is transparency, so we can understand, we can replicate what it is that's going on. We can evaluate ourselves what's going on. Then as a methodology matures over time, you might have particular practices that go and standards that go along with that methodology. So to me, at least with the Transparency Initiative, really looking at, are people being transparent with what they're doing so we have a fair chance of being able to evaluate what it is that they are doing. Last but not least, kind of looking to the future. One other thing that AAPOR Council did this year, June, is to pass essentially a strategy document that we call for 2025. You can find this on the website. And the idea here is, again, we're in a time of change, and because of the way AAPOR works and the way the chapter here works, we're probably yearly cycles of a president, and so you don't have people that are there longer term. You need some kind of guidepost to help guide the organization over the longer haul. So what AAPOR 2025 does, it lays out about 8 or 9 different areas that say in 2025, this is what we think AAPOR should look like. And again, the hope is that between now and then that the organization will strive to reach those. It's got three things I really want to point out. One was an assessment of what shouldn't change. AAPOR's been around for 70 some odd years. And what are the key things that have kept that organization around? Well, in reality, it's not the methodologies that have been used, it's the values. In particular, the collegiality, transparency, the belief in sharing information, those values. So we see in the year 2025, there shouldn't be a change in that. We should still be an open organization that shares information, that has task force reports that we make available not only to members, but to everybody in the industry. The second area, though, that's important is to recognize that AAPOR shouldn't in 2025 be a survey organization. And I say that carefully because the surveys aren't going away, but we should be looked at as an organization that looks at opinions, attitudes, behaviors in various different ways that they can be measured. So that's why I'm hoping that we will continue to broaden the appeal of who is an AAPOR member. So we're having some very different types of faces, certainly by the year 2025, if not 2015 or 2014. And the last but not least is international. And again, we start with the A in our name for American, and yet SMR still has E in their name. We need to recognize that AAPOR actually is already an international organization. if you look at the membership at the national level, the fastest growth, and more than 10% of the members are from outside of the US. I have the great pleasure of being able to work internationally, and I realize that a lot of particularly developing economies, research has now just become something that they're using, and they're just learning how to go about doing these types of things. Organizations like AAPOR, in conjunction with WAPOR, BESIMAR, and ASA, and other groups, can do a lot of good, I think, in these emerging areas in particular, in helping folks to start to learn how to do good research in this day and age. So I see AAPOR in 2025 being really embracing that international scope that, again, we've already started down that path. I guess that was really all that I wanted to say. I didn't want to take up too much time. I'm not a political pollster. I watch and consume the stuff that you guys put out all the time, so I'm not going to talk about your area because you guys are the experts in this. But I do have time for a couple questions if anybody has any particular burning things that they'd like to ask.
And we'll also have a Q&A at the end as well, but Lois?
Yeah, I have a question about the TI.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, what proportion would you say of AAPOR has signed on to the TI? Proportion of companies, not individual ones.
Right, proportion, I'll be honest, I don't have the proportion at the top of my head. I will tell you that, and we're going to have press releases that come out, is we're waiting until organizations go through the whole, it's almost like submitting a manuscript, right? Because you got to submit stuff and it gets reviewed. But we've had close to 50 organizations that since it launched earlier in September, we had a kind of a pre-launch with some groups. Over 50 organizations that are now in the process of being reviewed. So that's I think that's a pretty decent chunk. And I know the one there, and it's a nice mix of universities, large groups, others. So we're very pleased with that. Other questions? All right, well, I will be around, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Now, for the panel discussion, allow me to introduce our moderator, Mike Morzicki, who will then give a few moments each of the panelists to discuss what they've been working on for this election cycle, and then we'll have time for a panel discussion and a Q&A. So Mike began his career as a reporter and editor at the Associated Press in Maine and then New Hampshire. First became involved in the survey research 20 years ago when the AP joined the TV networks in an exit poll tool. And then he eventually worked as the founding director of the AP polling unit. Closer to home, he's worked as an independent consultant for clients such as UMass Lowell, where he helped launch the Center for Public Opinion in 2011, Harvard School of Public Health, and Pew Research. One of his current clients is NBC News, where he's the manager of election polling and runs exit poll analysis for live election night programming on NBC and MSNBC. So we're very lucky to have him tonight. Very busy man at this time of year. So, Mike.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm honored and thrilled to be here. I want to thank Michael for your very insightful remarks, and the panelists for joining us. I also want to thank Chase Harrison, who was involved behind the scenes and did a tremendous amount of work to get New England AAPOR back on its feet. So thank you very much, Chase. And I want to thank all of you for coming here, most of all for this kickoff event. It's really exciting to see the organization back on its feet here. A quick disclaimer, any opinions I express, which I will have a few, are strictly my own, not those of any current or past clients, and retweet not equal endorse. So, I should get my, hold on a second. Michael's. Okay, so as Steve alluded to, and Michael certainly, we are certainly at a crossroads in the survey research field. Actually, I have a question. I recognize a number of you. I'm trying to get a sense of to what extent folks in this room are professional survey researchers or survey research students or not, or who really don't, or maybe more interested in the politics and don't have exposure. So I don't know, the survey researchers or students, Okay. Okay. Because I'm going to try to keep this accessible to all here. We are certainly at a crossroads. We're in very interesting times, and I'm not sure if I mean that in the Chinese sense of the term, or Chinese curse sense of the term, or not. You know, probability-based polling has served us well for many decades, but clearly faces a variety of some serious challenges, including, as Steve mentioned, declining response rates. There are just cultural and technological changes, vast changes that are really changing how we do what we do. I will say that on the whole, and there are analyses such as from 538 that indicate that polls are still largely accurate. There are certainly exceptions, but that by and large, what we do still seems to work, despite the fact that there's high non-response. High non-response does not necessarily mean non-response bias. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. As discussed, there's the debate of probability versus non-probability. This has been going on in the survey research world for more than a decade now. It took on a much higher profile, I would say, this summer when CBS News and New York Times announced a partnership with YouGov, the non-probability online pollster, and Brian will be talking about them certainly. So that kind of came out much more publicly at that point. There's also some hybrid of the two going on with IVR, interactive voice response, automated polling that to try to cover cell phones. Some of them are now using opt-in online as well. When this happened during the summer, there was a column on WashingtonPost.com website that suggested that a dichotomy between tradition versus innovation, and suggested that Michael here might actually be the president of the Association of Buggy Book Manufacturers. I think that's honestly a false dichotomy. I think it's actually that we actually have a tradition of innovation. I was thinking, going back on some of the innovations, and this is actually too long of a list for me to read, but this spans basically 3/4 of a century, going back to the earliest days of survey research. And there's always been a great deal of careful attention paid to methods and to studying, to making decisions based on empirical evidence. And I think we still see that as well with non-probability polling. I think that this is actually innovation within the tradition of survey research. I should give a disclaimer that my own background, my own upbringing in the field was within the probability approach. In the sense that to be able to generalize, to have statistical inference, to generalize from a small sample, it's kind of magical in a way. It's you interview hundreds of people or 1,000 people, and you're able to project this to populations of millions. That you need to have a random basis for of selection. I also recognize that there are a lot of practical challenges that cause us to diverge from a pure probability sampling. I actually use the term probability-based. We can talk about this certainly in our discussion. That I think it matters to try, but I also recognize that there are other approaches. I think the experimentation is really important at this point, and exploring other organs. And I'm sorry, but my phone keeps going off. Somebody must be tweeting, right? I'm sorry about that. So, in New England, we have a number of interesting races, the ones that I've highlighted in red. And I also meant to say, I hope that we'll have a mix tonight of substantive discussion of the races, the politics in New England in the midterms, as well as the methodological. And I think we're having that already. We have the races in red are races that according to the polling that's been done, seem to be within the margin of sampling error or pretty close to it. And I would I actually calculated this. We have an average of 1.17 hot races per state right now, including CD06 in Massachusetts, my own congressional district, which was the only congressional district in the country to vote out an incumbent Democrat during the primaries this year. And Doug will be able to talk about Connecticut. Andy, I hope will have a few words to say about New Hampshire, which certainly has some interesting races, and also in Maine, where he's been polling. I'm not going to read all of this list. The point is that we have a lot of polling in New England, especially in the states with the hottest races. There are more than 30 pollsters active in this election cycle, including around 20 who are nonpartisan. I think the partisanship is certainly an issue that you should keep in mind when you're evaluating polls. Covers most of the contemporary methodologies that we see, and also, frankly, there's a range of quality. There's some that's better than other, regardless of the methodology involved. There's some who take more care, I would say, than others do. I'm not going to really talk a lot about this because I think we have a number of people who don't need the kind of introduction to what we do here. Except I will just mention that, obviously the rise of cell phones, now more than 40% nationally, do not have landlines anymore. Many of those who do have landlines can't really be reached on them. That it's really essential that surveys one way or another cover cell population. And ultimately, the big question is covering to me. Do you cover everybody or a large proportion of the people in the population that you're trying to survey, or are there chunks that are missing? And I have some thoughts also on the opt-in online on this, in that there's non-coverage of those who don't have internet access, which is a small, maybe 10, maybe 20%, for a small share. But one question I would have is, what about people who are online but don't know that they can join the panel, don't know that they can join YouGov or SurveyMonkey or whoever? So Michael talked about transparency, which I think ultimately is the key here. Regardless of what you think about different methodological approaches, if pollsters don't disclose their methods, they're not transparent about their methods, how can you evaluate what they're doing? I think that's really more critical than ever. It's been in the ethics codes of organizations like AAPOR, National Council on Public Polls, Council of American Survey Research Organizations for decades, but it's really more important than ever. There's a transparency initiative, and there are also independent efforts. And I would point out Mark Blumenthal at HuffPost Pollster. You can reach via pollster.com. Really does great work collecting data on all of the publicly released polls. You can go to the site and download spreadsheets that give you a great deal of data about methods and about sample sizes and about all a number of the things that you need to know to evaluate the quality of polls. They also have some very nice charts. One fan of whom is Mr. Colbert. This was the other night. I think Mark was quite proud of that. So I will just mention a few of the questions to consider when evaluating the polls. I think these apply to people who are in the field or people who aren't. A big one is who conducted the poll and why. A lot of the polls that we see in poll aggregation sites like HuffPost Pollster and so many others, 538 and so on, do have partisan, sometimes overt partisan sponsorship, or the polling firms themselves may do partisan work but release some polls on their own under their own name. There's increasing suspicion that there are some firms that are getting into the polling game just to game the aggregates. And I think we really need to keep an eye on that. Questionnaire design and wording and order is very important. I know Andy has some thoughts on how to do that sometimes may vary a bit from how others do it. Certain things about people's knowledge and ability to answer questions. He's done a lot of research into their the polling that we do, whether people have the ability to really answer, we're asking with any kind of a basis of knowledge. Likely voter screening in elections. Yes, we'll shut down. Okay. Sorry about that. You know, likely voter screening is certainly an issue, especially in a midterm where turnout it won't be as high. Weighting of the data, which in most polls happens at the back end. In I think it's fair to say in online, non-probability online, there's sort of the equivalent of that goes into the actual selection of the respondents up front, where you're matching to a target sample. And often the details of many pollsters don't disclose those details, and I think that's a problem. When you're looking at the analysis, look for cherry picking or the results, particular results being cherry picked. And a key thing really, I think, is survey error. We often will see margin of error, and I really like to use the term margin of sampling error, because sampling error, which can be quantified, that's what the margin of error is. There are a whole lot of other things that can cause error in surveys, and many of them are on this list here, and that gets overlooked sometimes. Though margin of sampling error plus or minus 4.38 percentage points implies a level of precision, and the way the polls get analyzed, and especially with aggregation, we get this sense that there's this incredible precision, and it's not laser surgery. It is really remarkable to me how accurate polls can be, but it's not laser surgery. There are limits to the precision. I see the margin of sampling error in my own mind. I add a point or two, or depending on who's doing the poll. You know, I add. That's why in my first list with the hot races, there were a couple where it's outside sampling error, but it's not that far off. So I think we need to keep those things in mind. The last thing I'll say is about poll aggregation, because we do see so much of it. It's really this year is kind of the rise of. It started in recent cycles, but especially now the forecasters and the aggregation is really quite widespread, and perhaps at the expense of some of the polling that would go into the aggregation. This is an issue that Frank Newport Gallup raised after the 2012 elections. On the one hand, I do think it's essential to look at multiple polls. When you see the results of one poll, you want to see what other polls have done, because even the best polls, the polls conducted to the highest standards, can get it wrong. I've conducted polls that have not been as accurate in retrospect as I wish, even though they were to the highest standards and not inexpensive standards. But I often see these days people say, well, you just put them into an average and it makes it all right. Well, that depends what goes into the average. And I came across something at NBC, the first read. They had a piece during the summer that I thought really kind of encapsulated the issue. And I think the aggregators do a lot of great work. And again, Pollster.com, tremendous service. This gets more to the precision issue, though. So NBC News first read. Be very careful of these aggregation polling sites. They don't always make the data better. There are actually polling firms out there who seem to have been created for the sole goal of influencing or balancing out these aggregation sites. That's one issue. And then there's the issue of what goes in the averages. To the folks who run these aggregation sites, realize that when you mix crap with sirloin, that makes the sirloin taste like crap too. So I would just keep those things around. So now I'm going to, maybe I should have ended on a different note. I think it's an important point. So now I am going to introduce the first of our panelists, and we're going to do this in geographic order from south to north, from southern New England up to northern New England, starting with Connecticut. Our first panelist is Doug Schwartz, who is director of the Quinnipiac University poll in Connecticut. He is responsible for the poll's methodology and all aspects of the survey process. He directs each Quinnipiac poll from conception through the data analysis. Started out with Connecticut and has expanded the Quinnipiac polling empire to A number of other states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Virginia, Iowa, Colorado, New York City, and national polls. Doug began his career as a survey associate with CBS News Election and Survey Unit, and as an election night analyst for the late 60 Minutes correspondent at Grad. He has taught courses on polling methodology, and it is certainly worthy of note that he is a past president of the New England chapter of AAPOR. Doug has a bachelor's degree from Connecticut College. He's earned both a master's in political science with a concentration in survey research and a PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut. So please join me in welcoming Doug Schwartz.
Thank you, Michael. I'm not going to throw too many figures at you this evening. I'm going to share some stories, polling in the trenches, if you will. You may have heard that our Connecticut governor's race was rated the nastiest in the nation. Wesley was just an analysis. Thank you, Connecticut. Well, not maggots. Not much of a surprise from what I've been seeing. The candidates have been hammering each other, and what I'm going to talk about is not only have they been attacking each other, but they've also been going after us. We are an independent poll, and they've decided to make us their target. I feel pretty good about that, because when you're getting criticized by both Democrats and Republicans, you have to be doing something right. You know, so that's okay. Now, criticism of independent polls by the campaigns is nothing new at all. You have to have pretty tough skin to be an independent poll, because campaigns always, when they're losing, they're going to go after you, right? What I found interesting in the last 2 weeks is how they're doing it. They're doing it in very unconventional ways, both sides. Let me first start with the Democrats in Malloy. Again, very close race that we're finding, very heated. It's Dan Malloy, he's the incumbent Democrat. He's facing Republican Tom Foley, who he faced in 2010, and he barely won the first time by less than a percentage point. And I feel like we're seeing this same movie. It's neck and neck, 43% for Malloy, 43% for Foley in our latest poll. Nothing seems to have changed from 4 years ago. Looks like a race that's going down to the wire. So about a week or so ago, we announced that we were coming out with a poll in the governor's race. This is what we typically do. A day before we release a poll, we put out what's known as an advisory to the media saying Quinnipiac is going to release a poll on the governor's race in Connecticut the next day. So a few hours later, I'm at home, I'm looking at my iPad, and all of a sudden I see on this website, it's kind of like the Drudge Report for Connecticut, it's CT Capital Watch, that the Quinnipiac poll is getting attacked. I'm like, what? We're getting attacked for what? We haven't even put out a poll yet. The Democratic Governors Association has put out a press release saying, don't trust the Quinnipiac poll that's coming out tomorrow. It's going to be wrong. Their last poll was wrong. In September, they had Malloy down by 6 points. You're not going to be able to believe this poll. It's just going to be wrong. And not just that state, but in some of their other states, they're underestimating Democratic support, like in Iowa and Colorado. You just don't trust the poll. Now, I've never seen this before. How can you possibly criticize our numbers before you've even seen them? I'm like, really? And the irony, of course, was the next day when we released the poll, Malloy was doing well. He had gained 6 points and was in a tie with Foley. I'm like, wouldn't you want to wait until after we actually released the numbers to criticize us? The other thing that I took note of at the time, I thought about blogging, but I didn't, was the Democratic Governors Association put out a press release, and they were saying these things about our past polls that weren't even accurate. I'm like, did you bother to check the numbers? They were saying what our party identification distribution was on these polls, and they were wrong. I'm like, you didn't even go to the press release and look up what our party identification was? Didn't you want to like get it right? They were trying to extrapolate and guess what our party ID was in past polls. I was pretty surprised by this, but I have to say the Republican candidate for Governor Tom Foley also surprised me. So we come out with a poll that's a tie. Usually candidates, feel pretty good about that they're in a tough race. So Foley, though, does something which I hadn't seen before. He decides not to attack the poll we just put out. He decides to go after the poll that we released over a month ago that showed him in the lead. A poll that's showing him in the lead he's attacking. Has that ever happened? Why? I'm like, you're kidding me. You're attacking a poll that said you were doing well. Now, I get it. He wanted to show that he's not losing steam and all of that. But I have to say, I was really surprised by that he would go back to an old poll and say that old poll was wrong. And some of his reasoning was just stuff that I'd never heard before. He said we made a mistake in how we reported the numbers, that we kind of mixed up the Democratic and the independent categories. It wasn't that we, had a bad likely voter model or anything. We just made a mistake. We switched the Democratic label with the independent label. I'm like, you're kidding me. That's your criticism? You think that we would do something like that? So that was off. One other thing that really struck me about this is sort of how the whole tone of how partisan pollsters work with independent pollsters has changed. So in the past, how would it be if we put out numbers that a campaign didn't like? They'd call me. They would pick up the phone, their campaign pollster, and said, so what are you guys doing? What's your likely voter model? What's your screen? How are you weighting? What are you doing? We'd have a nice professional conversation, and we'd say, okay, we're doing this, and then the campaign would tell me, well, we're doing that, we're using a listed sample, or whatever they're doing that's different. Okay, now we understand why we have different numbers. Now it's a totally different game. They're going public. Like I said, the Democrats went public, the Republicans went public. But beyond that, the candidate himself attacked the poll. And I'm like, you couldn't even get a flack to do that? That they actually Foley went out and called reporters on the day of the press release. He has nothing better to do than to call reporters and say, get into methodology, which he was actually incorrect about. So he started talking about party ID, and they had the wrong number of Democrats, Republicans, and now I realize some pollsters do weight their data and they target it to a certain party identification that they expect on election day. Now, we don't weight our numbers by party identification, how many Democrats versus how many Republicans, because it can change from election to election. My favorite example is 2008, when President Obama got elected. And what was the split between Democrats and Republicans? There were actually 7 points more Democrats than Republicans nationally, according to exit polls, 39 to 32%. But nobody would have guessed that. If you're just looking at exit polls, the prior presidential exit poll in 2004 showed an exact tie. So, you just can't know. There's no certainty. Now, the campaigns want to say that there's certainty in how many Democrats will show up and how many Republicans, but nobody knows. So I'm just putting that out there, that the candidates, that's probably one of the most typical criticisms of the independent polls is our party ID. That's what they often go after. But I have, the same response that I've always had is nobody really knows what it's going to be on election day, election to election. With that, I'm going to close. I'll go to the next one.
Thank you, Doug. Our next speaker is Brian Schaffner, who is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at UMass Amherst, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also a faculty associate at the Harvard Institute for Quantitative Social Science. Brian is the founding director of the UMass Poll, which is a political polling and survey research center based in Amherst. He is a fellow for the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies and has served as the political science program director for the National Science Foundation. His research focuses on public opinion, survey research, and campaigns and elections. Brian is co-editor of a book on political framing, co-author of a book on the challenge of inference in political science research methods, and author of the book Politics, Parties, and Elections in America. Brian has authored more than 24 referee journal articles and has been an invited contributor to the HuffPost Pollster blog, which I had mentioned. Brian earned his PhD in political science at Indiana University. So please welcome Brian Schaffer. Just go right there. Oh yeah, right. Go now. Okay.
Thank you for the AAPOR for inviting me out to do this. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I was sort of instructed to split between methodology and substance, so I'm going to sort of do exactly what I was told to do.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about a little bit about our methodology, and then a little bit about sort of what we've done so far in this election season. So we are, I think, the main organization in Massachusetts that uses online polling. I think Steve did a column a while back about describing the different pollsters and identified us as the online pollster in Massachusetts for political polling. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do it. And we work with a big organization that goes by the name of YouGov, started by a political scientist from Stanford by the name of Doug Rivers. And I've been working with YouGov since well before 2008 for academic work, but since 2011 to do the more political polling. I checked the other day, and nearly 90% of American adults now report using the internet. So that's a good thing in terms of sort of minimizing coverage bias in some ways, although it brings up a good point that we can discuss later. The major challenge, however, for internet polling, this is somewhat to some extent the point Mike raises, is that there's no directory of email addresses or who's online that we can go from. So we can't do something like random digit dialing when it comes to online polling. And so essentially what YouGov does, and working with them, they go out and recruit as many people as they can get. They have a panel that is well over 1 million panelists nationwide. And they also work with vendors who have panelists of their own when needed. And essentially what YouGov does, for example, when we do a survey in Massachusetts, we might say, okay, we need a sample of, say, 500 registered voters in Massachusetts. And YouGov will essentially select using census data and some appended data to that, maybe voter files or whatever, select essentially what we call the target sample. So this is, and when I say census data, I'm not talking about the actual sort of census, but the American Community Survey or some large sample like that with some political data appended. And so they'll select the target sample. Essentially what we would, if we could take a truly random sample of Massachusetts registered voters, what it should look like. And so we know something about that target sample. We know the demographics that are, for example, included in the census file, and maybe some other things that come from any other data sets that we've appended through commercial vendors. And so then we know what the target sample should look like. And essentially what we do then is go into the YouGov panel and do matching using a range of demographic and political variables to find the closest match to the people that should be our target sample. So if we have a 30-year-old Latina woman with 2 kids in Worcester, YouGov goes into their panel and finds the closest thing to that they can, and then invites that person to come take the survey. And usually, actually, they invite more people to take the survey than we need. So they don't just go after 500, but they might, ask, say, 800 people, expecting that some will decline, and then having more people that they've surveyed that allows for a better match at the end. So once they've invited the matches from their panel to take, they then do the closest match to each person who's in the target sample, and then we do the post-stratification weighting that other surveys do to essentially fix any remaining imbalance in the sample. So even with with the front end matching, you still have to do a little bit of weighting at the back end. It just tends to be a lot less. When I've worked with for YouGov data, the weights often top out around maybe 3, whereas a lot of phone polls, they go 8 or higher. So the question is how. So that's just sort of a quick rundown of how the methodology works at a basic level. The question, of course, is how accurate are the internet polls, and there's lots of ways to measure this. And so, like, there's basic ways, which is just when we do an internet poll, how close are we to the final result of an election? So an election result is a population parameter that we can then suggest that we were attempting to estimate with our poll. So, for example, when Nate Silver does his analysis of the 2012 election polls that were held right before the election, he finds an average error for internet polls of about 2.1. And not all of those internet polls were YouGov polls. And that compared very favorably with the average error for phone polls. So that's one measure. Another similar thing could be done with recent polling in Massachusetts. And so the final YouGov poll, that one was not actually done with us. That was done, I think, on their own for the 2012 Senate race. Had a very low error rate, so that's just essentially how far off they were from the final margin for Warren. And then our poll with YouGov for the 2013 Massachusetts Senate race also was only about a point off of the final margin in the Markey race. So that's one approach, but I've done a lot of different work in terms of trying to analyze how strong these methods are. And so I'll talk briefly about a 2010 study that I did with my colleague at Harvard, Stephen Solvehair, where we ran at the same time a telephone dual mode telephone survey, so calling landlines and cell phones, mail survey, and a YouGov online survey with the identical questionnaires. This study was published in the Journal of Political Analysis, and the replication data is online, so you can go play with it yourself. But we use 8 questions that could be compared to validated government sources, so things like the proportion of the population who are smokers or who own a house, or things that we know pretty well with census data. And so we use those as sort of own population parameters, and then listed there. And then got a sense of how well each mode did at estimating the parameter values with the survey data. And the online survey we conducted compared very favorably with the other modes. We also asked because we're political science professors, we asked a lot of attitude questions, which of course we don't know the population parameters for those questions, but we can still do comparisons across modes. In general, we found that on those questions that the internet or the online module, was about 4 or 5 points different from the other modes. Again, we don't know what the truth is on those. It's just getting a sense of how consistent the estimates we get are. We've done some more recent work that I presented at the AAPOR conference that I don't really have the slides for here, but actually benchmarking 2 different online approaches, the YouGov approach and then Knowledge Networks, which is now GFK approach, to the American National Election Study, which is an in-person survey that's conducted. It's sort of seen as the gold standard political science survey. And again, we get very consistent results where we get very strong, sort of unbiased, seemingly unbiased estimates, not just of population parameters, but also of essentially the correlational structure of the data. So even when we're looking at correlations between variables, we still get pretty consistent results across modes. We feel like, at least in terms of those tests that we've done so far, that we have a method that seems to get similar results. And we can debate about probability and non-probability examples, and I would say that this is sort of a probability-informed approach I guess. And I would say that no matter what kind of survey you're doing these days, you're relying a lot on modeling. And essentially, in terms of the weighting, if you're doing a phone poll, you are relying a lot on assumptions you're making about whether you're adjusting for the right things. We're also making assumptions about adjusting for the right things. And the key is really if those assumptions hold them. And I think any kind of approach that is using those assumptions is going to have some concerns. So what have we done in the Baker-Coakley race? We've done a couple polls so far, and I'll just sort of go through what I think might be some of the interesting things that might inform this election. The online format allows us to do some sort of fun things. So for example, we just give people a text box and say, what's the most important issue to you? And then we just generate a word cloud from it. And so clearly the economy and taxes are big, jobs. So economic issues are very big in this election, not very surprising. And then when we ask people, who do you think who do you trust more to handle those issues? Actually, the two biggest issues, the economy and taxes, Baker has a slight edge over Coakley. Coakley, of course, has an edge in education, and actually Baker does pretty well for a Republican in terms of healthcare. So, if people are voting on the economic or taxes issues, that might bode well for Baker, given that he performs fairly well on those. We also allow our respondents to essentially place several politicians and the parties and themselves on an ideological spectrum. So we sort of ask people, where are you very liberal, somewhat liberal? And then is Charlie Baker, liberal, conservative, very conservative? And this gives you a sense of the average placement of each of the Massachusetts voter there in the center, and then where they see the candidates vis-a-vis where they see the parties and some of the other major politicians in the state. And as you can see, one reason Charlie Baker is doing pretty well is because he's separated himself significantly from the Republican Party. So he clearly is viewed as substantially more moderate than the Republican Party, which it's sort of a necessary precursor to being remotely competitive in a Massachusetts election. And really, if you look at the sort of the average Massachusetts voter, they're about equidistant from Coakley and Baker. And I'll note one other thing. Warren is the most liberal politician we've measured yet on our ideological scale. So people see her as, she's also the most popular. So Baker's doing well in terms of promoting himself as a moderate. Another thing I wanted to point out was the importance of turnout. So one of our likely voter, the main likely voter thing that we use actually is a scale where people can place themselves on a scale from 0 to 100, how likely they are to vote. Most people place themselves anywhere, not surprisingly, somewhere between 90 and 100. Some people go below that. And as you can see, it matters what turnout is, because if there was going to be greater turnout, if some of those people who aren't sure they're going to vote did vote, Coakley does much better. So she's doing great among people who's placed themselves as a likelihood of voting somewhere below, say, 93 or so. But it's among those core voters where Baker is basically neck and neck with Coakley, and that comes from our September poll. But I also wanted to just talk a little bit about gender and independence. I mean, I haven't been polling in Massachusetts forever. I've only seen a few elections here, but I've always made note of the fact that most Democrats tend to win in the state with a huge gender gap, huge advantage among women, and basically breaking even or just losing men by a little bit. And you can see that was sort of the path that Deval Patrick and Elizabeth Warren took. They both won women by a big amount, and then came close among men or broke even. Those are based on our exit polls that we ran in 2010 and 2012. You can see that Baker is actually doing much better among men than he did in 2010, and better than Scott Brown did in 2012. And Coakley's doing about the same as where she was, or about the same as where, say, Elizabeth Warren or Deval Patrick was with women in those polls. But she's losing men by a bigger margin. So that's one potential reason why she's in a closer race than, say, Deval Patrick or Elizabeth Warren ended up being in. But the patterns among independents, and these are not, we're not talking about unenrolled because in Massachusetts you register as Democrat, Republican around the world. But these are people who, when asked, do you identify with a party, say, I'm an independent. So you can see that in 2010, 2012 exit polls that Charlie Baker, Scott Brown won independents by, say, 15 to 20 points. I certainly went back and calculated from our 2012 or from our 2010 exit poll that about 42% of the voters were political independents. And if you sort of do the calculations based on that, if you assume that that's going to be roughly accurate in this election, then you need to assume that Baker has to win independents by at least 30 points. Because Coakley will probably get about 85, 90% of the Democratic vote. Baker will probably win almost every Republican vote. And therefore, he needs to win independents by about 30 points. And interestingly, if you look at our two polls, our September poll, we had Baker ahead by a few points. And in that poll, he was winning independents by a pretty big amount. And these are including leaners. And then in our October poll, we actually had Coakley ahead by a few points. And in that one, Baker was not winning independents by that sort of magical sort of 30-point mark. One final note about independents, in our last poll, we did a little experiment where we actually showed our respondents a grid of where the candidates stood on a few issues. And independents, when they saw where the candidates stood, liked Coakley a lot more, or thought Coakley was a better representative of their own views. And it didn't really move them on Baker. And so, that might be a clue about how the campaign might move independents as we sort of wind down the last couple weeks. So that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Brian. And our final speaker tonight is Andy Smith, who has been the director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center since 1999. Andy is an associate professor in the UNH Department of Political Science. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Cincinnati and learned survey research at UC's Institute for Policy Research. Andy and the UNH Survey Center are well known for their polling for media organizations, including the Portland, Maine Press Herald, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, Hartford Courant, USA Today, CNN, and Fox News, as well as local television stations in Boston, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. Andy has published in the American Political Science Review, Public Opinion Quarterly, and is co-author with David Moore of Out of the Gate, the New Hampshire Primary and the Political Process, which will be published in the winter of 2015 by the University Press of New England. So please welcome Andy Smith.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming.
Sorry. Yep.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight and for the panel here. The folks who are putting this panel together, to be able to talk a little bit about elections. I want to talk, first off, very briefly about the New Hampshire and Maine elections. I assume since you're all in this room, you have some relation to public opinion research. You can probably read the polls and interpret them fairly well. But before I get going, I want to really thank our staff at the Survey Center. Any of you guys who do work in surveys, we're just the faces. Everybody else does the work and shoves the data in front of us. And we go out and look nice about it. But the other guys that do the work, Zach Azem's here from our staff tonight. I want to thank him for the work he's done. I think overall, one of the things with this election that I guess after doing election polling for so many years, and some of the research that Mike was talking about that I've looked at, is that we're all interested in politics. We're interested in public opinion research, but most people aren't. Most people don't care about politics. They don't care about policy. Our government is designed to elect people, and so they can worry about it, so we don't have to. So when we're thinking about elections and thinking about public policy positions, you gotta remember the people that we're talking to aren't. And so when you're looking at polls, especially polls that are being done 3, 4, 6 months before election, you should assume that the people that are answering that poll have no idea what's going on, are not paying any attention to it, and probably won't until about now. So the World Series is going to start this weekend. So next week is about when people are really going to start paying attention to the election that's coming up. Keep that in the back of your head as you're thinking about any sort of poll that you're looking at. The second thing is that people are partisan. We root for political parties like we root for sports teams. And we don't change our minds very often. So when the Red Sox win the World Series last year, you can't get a ticket here. People watch it on TV all the time. It's on the radio. It's in the bars. People talk about it. This year, easy to get a ticket for the Red Sox. They stink. The same is true for sport or for politics. When a political party is doing well, people talk about that party. They like it. They like the top of the ticket. They come out and vote. They talk about it all the time. When they're not doing so well, they don't show up. So the Democratic Party right now is not a real good brand name as President Obama being the head of the party, the manager of the team, or the leadoff hitter, or whatever you want to describe it as, whatever sports metaphor you want. Nationally, his approval ratings in the low 40s. In New Hampshire, he's now at 38% approval. That colors the entire race. Not because Democrats are going to go out and say, well, heck, I don't like these Democrats anymore, I'm going to vote for the Republicans, because they're not buying tickets. They're going to stay home from the election. So turnout in midterm elections in particular is key. Who's going to show up? Who has the motivation to show up? Republicans will. Democrats, not so much. So a lot of the things that I'm looking at with elections isn't who people are going to vote for, what issues are important, so much of that. I want to see who's showing up and work with that assumption. So I think that in the last couple of weeks of this campaign, the things to pay attention to are what is going to happen at the national level, because I don't really think that there's a lot that the campaigns can do to really manipulate the election much more. In New Hampshire, for example, there's been over $30 million spent on this campaign. And this is a state with maybe 450,000 people that will vote this election. It'd be nice just to get a check for that rather than having it all go to the TV stations. But there's so many wall-to-wall ads on TV about this. It's noise now, it's background noise. However, if the stock market drops another 500 points or 1,000 points over the next couple of weeks, that will have an impact on the election. If we have 2, 3, or 5 more Ebola patients show up in the United States, that will affect the election. If ISIS takes the Baghdad airport, that will affect the election. What is any candidate going to be able to do to impact those things? Zip. So I think a lot of the stuff that's going on, and will determine who wins or loses in a lot of these elections, including New Hampshire, is out of the control of the campaigns. So just turning to New Hampshire, it gets to my first point about how most people don't pay any attention, but those people who are the politicos know things are going to be close because they understand what are the overall dynamics of an election campaign, what happens in midterm elections. I like the quote that Charlie Cook used recently about midterm elections. He said that midterm election comes in 3 varieties for the White House party: bad, really bad, and horrific. And we're between probably really bad and horrific for Democrats right now. And the people on the Democratic Party knew this last year.
Just want to say that time for questions.
Yep, I'll go fast. One of my former students is Gene Shaheen's chief of staff. He said this waivers can go down the wire. They'd be lucky if they could squeak it out. But she was ahead in polls throughout the summer until we had a poll out in August and showed it close. Did that mean that the race wasn't going to be close, or that Shaheen suddenly had something happen in the campaign? No, it's because nobody was paying any attention. It's summertime. New Hampshire's a beautiful place in the summer, by the way. And then our primary is not until September. So we haven't had any political activity at all. So right now, Shaheen is more popular. She's got plus 13 net favorabilities. Brown's unpopular, minus 18. He's had to endure about 3 months now with negative ads against him. That said, this is going to go down to the wire. It's in single digits. I'd say Shaheen probably leading right now, but not by a lot. She's been under 50% all year, and as an incumbent, if you're under 50%, you're in trouble. So she's going to have a difficult time. Our governor's race, I think, should go on the list of close races. It's probably going to be the incumbent governor who wins, but it's getting closer. Again, nothing to do with her campaign, but the national political events. And states governors of the one-offs kind of separate themselves from what goes on nationally a little bit more. They're the CEO of their own little country, and they have their own performance that gets measured. But both of our congressional races, I would argue, are very easy, are likely pickups for Republicans. The incumbent Democrats have been at about 40%, In the polls, or in the second CD, the incumbent Ann Custer has been under 40% for the last year, pretty much. And her net favorability rating is about -15, -20 right now. Not good, but those are two races that I would definitely put on. Maine's an interesting state. This is a replay of the 2010 election. Race for governor there, Paul LePage won barely because Democrats split the vote in 2010 between Libby Mitchell and Elliott Cutler, who is an independent. And Maine has somewhat of a tradition of electing independents. And the thing with that is, this time around, it's about the same thing, except it's not Libby Mitchell, as Mike B. showed, as the second district congressman. He's proving to be as inept of a candidate as Libby Mitchell was in 2010, which caused Democrats to run over to Elliott Cutler in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. So in 2010, we saw that essentially the Democratic Party was endorsing the independent candidate, saying, you know, our guy's not going to win, go vote for the independent. I think you might see something similar to that this time around. Paul LePage could win again, despite being one of the most divisive governors in the country. That way, I'm going to go to some opportunities we have as pollsters. We talked about all the problems that we have, but there's a couple things that are interesting. One of the things that's interesting is asking questions about who will win the election. David Rothschild has done quite a bit of work on this. And this is really a good question because it expands the universe of who's evaluating the election and how you evaluate the election. I'm not asking you who you're going to vote for and then add it all up, but of everybody that you see and everything that you hear and you read, who do you think is going to win? And that's actually proved more accurate in predicting the winner than the horse race question. Not the margin, but the winner. So that's one thing I think that I would encourage us to do. And the second thing is generic ballots. I just want to talk briefly about this because this is something I think is very important. We've seen a big increase in the number of polls that are done, particularly at the state level. State legislatures are very important, especially in those years ending in zeros, because they're going to be drawing the lines for the next 10 years in elections. And what I found is that you can do a pretty good job predicting the makeup of your state electorate, your state House and Senate, by using generic questions. So this is just a generic question we use. It comes basically from Gallup. Please think about the election for your representatives, the New Hampshire House of Representatives or Senate. Do you plan to vote for the Democratic or a Republican candidate for New Hampshire House of Representatives this time? And then we follow a program. Are you leaning towards it? And David Moore and Lydia Saad from Gallup did these sorts of predictions. They built a simple regression model that looked at the number of seats won versus the two-party percent of the vote that it took to win those seats, because we do have those little gerrymandered districts. For example, in New Hampshire, it takes about 53%. Democrats have to get about 53% of the popular vote to win majorities in the House and the Senate. And other states have various quirks. But we've done this in New Hampshire, and over the last 12 years, you can see that there's two things. This has got 3 lines. Let me back this up. This is the actual number of seats won in our House of Representatives. We have 400 people in our House of Representatives. The myth is that everybody knows who their state rep is. The truth is, nobody knows who their state rep is. They don't. This is about as generic of a question as you can get. And it varies pretty big. And you can see in the midterm election years, it can jump quite a bit. So you say, how the hell are you going to predict a House that goes from roughly 180 Republican seats in 2008 to 296 Republican seats in 2010? What kind of crazy state is that? Well, when you ask the question, and we just use here the two-party, the percentage of, this is the graph, the percentage of the two-party vote that Republicans are going to get, and then multiply that percent times 400 to get the number of seats. So it's an unmodeled estimate. Not very good. Not very good at all. But when we ran these predictive models and did the regressions with making some adjustments because of the number of seats, you can see that we can get a pretty accurate prediction. 2012 wasn't quite as good. We get the same overall. The error was 34 seats off if we don't model it. If you model it, we're off by 11 seats, which is pretty good. You've got 400 seats in your House. In the Senate, we only have 24 seats in the Senate. This is the actual number of seats, and again, quite a bit of variety here. This is our unmodeled estimate. This is when we model it, and you can see it does a really good job. The error for the unmodeled that's 3 seats for our model is only one seat on average. So here's just the regression model. When you look at it, you can see that the one outlier we have is 2012 because we have to base this on data from previous elections. You got to know what your percentage of people that say they're going to vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate is in your poll, and you have to have the election results 2010, after 2010, we had new districts brought. We don't have any data on those new districts yet. So our estimate in 2012 was further off than any of the other estimates that we've had. And similar error in 2012, the state said was a little bit off. So I just wanted to bring this up as an opportunity to tell you about other things that you can do in your election polling that's more than just the horse race about who's going to win. And I think this is actually quite interesting because if you get down to that generic, who are you going to vote for in the state house? That's going to give you a much better indication of who's going to show up on election day. Because it's not voting for the well-known incumbent or the hated candidate over here. It's just, are you going to vote for the R and the D? As we know, most people do vote straight ticket, and partisanship, I think, is what matters. So thank you very much for your time here, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's detected a couple of common themes in several of the remarks in Michael's and others' remarks, that out of the challenges we face come opportunity to do things in new ways or otherwise to innovate, as we're talking about. And the modeling is, one way or another, really key to what we all do, no matter what approach we come from. The other thing I would just say very quickly is, as somebody who collects a check from NBC News, I don't have a problem with all that advertising money going to TV stations, but again, personal opinion. I have a lot of questions, but I want to open up the floor to you to ask questions of our panelists or of Michael as well. So, who's going to go first?
Good. With all the methodology, I hate to start this way, but I was going for the political. And I was just going to ask just the issues that are at stake, the degree to which these are national versus local. And Andy, you talked about the Senate race there and governor's races. I want to pose this to Doug, the issue of guns in Connecticut, and what has that, how has that factored into the gubernatorial race?
It's actually not a major issue. We did what do you think is the most important issue to your vote question in September, and it was all about the economy. 40% said the economy and jobs. Taxes was second, government spending was third, but it was clearly the economy was by far number one, and gun policy was in single digits. So for a small portion of the electorate, it can have an effect, and it's not clear which way it's going to play, whether or not, those small number of voters who it is the most important issue. They are slightly actually more pro-gun control, but it's not overwhelming.
In the back, yes.
In terms of polling, you guys conduct polls all year round, all the time, but you're in the final 3 weeks of an election. Is this the best time to be in this business or the worst?
I think it's the best. I think it's the best get going. Even if you do get attacked from time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, definitely get the attacks. I think it's the best in terms of, that it's really exciting to see what's going to happen. But in a lot of the races that we're polling on, and I did mention, we're in Florida with Fangate, and it's a neck and neck race there, and Colorado with governor and senator, neck and neck, Iowa, neck and neck. So it's tougher because, if you're just a point or two off, you could get the wrong winner. So that's why it's definitely, this is probably, I'd say, one of the most closest elections in the 20 years that I've been polling, and it definitely makes you a lot more stressed that even if you're within the margin of error, you could still be wrong.
I'll share an anecdote about why it's somewhat more difficult as well. How many of you have been called in the last week on a public poll or a party poll about who to vote for? Right, not many of you live in New Hampshire. In the last week, I've gotten 4 calls from Republicans and 3 calls from Democratic pollsters, and I happen to answer the phone, but I typically answer all of them. 4 of them, the Republicans ones, were surprising. 2 were from like the Republican. One was from the the Senate committee. One was from the Congressional committee, Scott Brown, and one was from Frank Ginta. They use the identical survey, which is no coordination between these. The survey just happened to be identical. And then the surveys from the Democratic Party were essentially identical. One question I think was different, but that's a lot of polling that's being done. That was just the party polls, and there are a number of other ones that I know I didn't get, and there were some that the tradition at my house is if you get a robo poll, I give it to my 14-year-old. If they're concerned about quality is that good, I can do the same. Meeting their standards of quality by having a 14-year-old being the likely voter. So we do get, I don't know how many of those we get because I wasn't there yet. My wife hangs up on them.
I've heard, Andy, that in a presidential primary season, it is not uncommon for a sample provider like SSI to sell everybody's phone number in Massachusetts at one point or another.
The odds in back in 2000, I looked at this for the New Hampshire presidential primary, and you had a greater than 1 chance of having your household complete a survey. Public survey, not the ones from the party or from campaign.
Going to go this way.
I was just wondering if the 3 of you could comment. There's been a lot of ink spilled on this in Massachusetts after the primary, but the idea that polls are pushing how people vote, insofar as, for example, with the Democratic primary, there was a lot of ideas about perhaps people were voting based off the polling of a potential Coakley matchup versus a Berwick matchup with Charlie Baker. So I was wondering how you think that affects things from your perspective.
Let me jump into that from the primary. One of the things I think is a major problem is we as political scientists, but especially the press, think that primary elections are the same as general elections, or a close cousin. And they're really completely different. So general elections are pretty easy to predict. For 95% of the voters, they're going to vote Republican or Democrat, and figuring out who's going to show up is a difficulty. But in a primary without those party labels, people don't care. They're going to vote for whoever is their party's nominee in November. And the swings that you get in primary elections are typical. And I do bring up AAPOR. Back in 2008 in New Hampshire, as you know, all the polls showed that Barack Obama was going to win the primary, Clinton wins the primary. This was a big scandal. AAPOR commissioned a study that looked at all of these things. They didn't answer the fundamental question, which I think is there, is that do the voters really care about who wins? And for the most part, they don't. And I've gone back and looked at New Hampshire polling before the presidential primary. They're almost always wrong. And they're wrong by fairly large magnitude, 10, 15 percentage points off getting the wrong winner regularly. And that's because the primaries are just a different animal. People make up their minds at the very end. They do consider things like which guy has the best chance of winning, which one screwed up in that last debate on Sunday night before the election. Who did I get the flyers from? My neighbor said that they're going to vote for somebody, so I said, what the heck, I'll vote for them too. I mean, in New Hampshire, even at the presidential level, where they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on these campaigns, you'll still see people flipping coins in the polling place on election day.
Brian, would you want to take that as well? I know that this was a big issue with the mass voting across. There was a lot of discussion.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I can't say whether that happened in the Massachusetts race. I mean, there is some research, like very good political science research, that shows that how viable you think a candidate is does affect your vote in a primary. Particularly, I mean, I think that research is done on presidential primaries, but the extent to which you think your candidate can win in a general election is a factor. Probably, I mean, not a huge, not the important factor, the most important factor, but it is a factor. So it's plausible that people looked at that and saw, looked at those general election reps and some voted strategically. I doubt. I mean, it certainly wasn't enough to make a difference, but that might have pushed some votes. And I mean, I'm not sure if there was a normative, slant, or like if you have a normative view of that. I mean, my view is sort of like, that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to vote on. If I'm a primary voter, like whether I think my candidate can win a general election, it seems as important as anything.
Be close.
Yes.
Andy Smith said that the main concern driving the voter is party identification. You look at the other chapter, the other presentation by Brian Schaffner, and it has about a third of the people being independent or undeclared. And in many things that I've read, it's that there are very few truly independent. People really have something else in their mind, although they might declare themselves, if you ask them, they'll say, I'm an independent. There are two apparently contradictory things out there. So could you tell me, how would you interpret it and how can it be used in?
Well, I think actually in the polling, if you do like the 7-point Michigan or a Gallup scale, and you look at those people who initially say they're independent and then which party they're leaning towards, they're typically almost as partisan as are the strong partisans, and often more partisan in their policies and their consistency in voting for a party than are the weak partisans. So I think it's first off misleading to call those people who are independents but leaners independents. And that really reduces the size of that independent pool, probably down into the 15 to 20% of the public. And then when you get down to an election, in a presidential election, you're probably looking at 10 to 15% of the electorate being independent. And in the midterm election, you're probably looking at 5 to 10%, because those people that are truly independent are like the people who don't root for the Red Sox or the Yankees and they live in Connecticut. They don't pay attention to baseball. These are the people that are more likely to be apolitical, nonpartisan. So I think that group that's really there to sway between independents and between the two parties is actually fairly small in the election.
But just to follow on that is that you have to deal with what the people say that they are, when in fact what you seem to think and what I've read is that people really have their mind made up, but they say independent. How do you distinguish those from the others?
Well, that's what we asked the Michigan question. You first ask, are you a Democrat, Independent, Republican, or what? And then if you're independent, we'll ask, well, do you lean more towards the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? And most people will tell you that they lean more towards one or the other. And you do end up with that group of people at the end, 15 to 20%, who either say they're Libertarians or Green Party members, or they're true independents.
Doug's done some great polling on baseball fans in Connecticut, but I don't want to. Yes, go ahead.
So you talked about how in polling aggregation, if you sort of take sirloin and craft and them together, you just make the sirloin orange. So different sort of aggregators try to get around that problem by, some of them, like Nate Silver breaks the pollsters, right, and sees how far they lean one direction or the other, or how accurate they've been, and gives weights and things like that. Other people sort of use medians and that sort of thing, just sort of like throw out everything except the polls that are sort of like just take the last 2 weeks of polls and take the median of that or something. It seems though that you talked about the transparency, that's like really important too, right? Because you can get the right answer and do it the wrong way, right? We see people that have sort of who aren't necessarily doing good polls or maybe even cheating a little bit to do that sort of thing. So how would you rate like how close you are as being important versus your methods that you use and how transparent you are? It seems like that's at least as important.
I would just make one point before I throw it to the panel here. I think there's too much focus just on horse race. I'm much more interested in the dynamics of the campaign and the issues that are motivating voters. And there is so much in it, and it just seems to be more and more a forecasting race. I'm kind of waiting for the aggregates of the aggregators to come along here, and then the aggregates of the aggregators of the aggregators. So I'd like to understand what people are really thinking, what is driving elections, what's driving the turnout, what's motivating people, and I don't think I'm a little concerned about that, but I would, who would like to take that? Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, it sounds like the question was about not just sort of how well you predict, but the extent to which your methods are sort of transparent, which I could not be in both in my sort of as a political scientist, but also in polling. I could not agree more. I mean, we actually put all of our polls up, like the raw data for our polls, so that if anyone wants to, they can download the data set and look at what we did. And again, we haven't put the ones up from this fall yet, mostly because we just haven't had time. But like anything we've done before this fall is on the Dataverse at Harvard, and anyone can grab that data. And I'd love to see that across the board. I can understand when you have a client who may not want that data out there, that is a restriction. But I mean, at the most basic level, the most transparent thing you can do is tell everyone exactly how you got your sample, and then give them the data to analyze and see if they come up with a different answer. We certainly had a lot of examples of that in academia, where scholars are publishing things that turns out they made a mistake, and so it's it'd be unrealistic to think that doesn't happen either by accident or sometimes on purpose in the polling as well.
And then Doug mentioned the problem of you can have the wrong horse in the lead, and even if it's well within sampling error, that just and even though I think there's increased sophistication about sampling error, that's a bad appearance.
Can I just, as a sort of axe to grind kind of thing? Actually, most pollsters, and I won't sort of name names, but that I look at actually don't calculate the margin of error correctly. That they're not actually adjusting for the fact that they're weighting the data, they're like, we had a poll that came out where we had, I think, 422 likely voters, and another poll came out with like 400, and their margin of error was magically sort of a good, it's quite a bit smaller than ours. But the reason is, like, if you sort of calculate up, they were calculating the margin of error based on the fact that the data were unweighted, which nobody's data are unweighted at this point. And so, at a basic level, even that, where you have a polling organization reporting the margin of error, you don't even know if that was calculated correctly or not.
That's a real problem, and it's really, I thought, started to crop up when RDD polls were doing dual frame, and a lot of pollsters are not calculating a design effect. You have a higher sampling error. And I had when I was doing work at UMass Lowell, I had a call from a reporter who said, well, how come your margin of error, you've got a sample of 1,000, how come the sample is plus or minus 4.5 points when this poll had 1,000 is only 3 points? He said, go talk to them because they don't know how to calculate the design effect. So that is a serious problem, and that's something that I know AAPOR is trying to address through education efforts and through its code, but I think that's still a persistent.
Let me add one thing to your comment about
One more question after your comment.
just with the prevalence of state-based polls and the aggregators aggregating within states. Here, I think we have a serious problem because the robopolls are so cheap that they dominate the averages that are calculated in these states, and so you'll see 4, 5, 6 polls that are either done by definite Republican or Democratic organizations, or the robopolls with whatever you want to value that methodology, and then you'll have a poll like Doug's or I hope it would be ours coming in, and if our polls are different than the aggregate that's made up from these suspect polls, we're the outlier, and we must be the poll that has the problems. So there are real issues about what happens with what goes into that soup that you're making there. And if it's all crappy stuff, the clean water that goes in is still going to be judged with the crap.
And I think the partisans are going in more in states where there is less gold, more traditional or just higher level methodologies, because there's more of an opportunity to move things. All right, one more question. I'm gonna Yes.
Thank you. I'll bring it back to the horse race aspects here. Here in Massachusetts, we have at least 3 sources of noise that could result in the polls being drastically wrong come November. One, I would say, is the fact that one party does not have a full slate. There's a strong Republican candidate for governor, but most people can't name it, anybody else on the ticket, even for the Senate. Second issue is all these high-profile ballot questions, which there was talk early in the campaign. I haven't seen this question lately. That could bring people to the polls who wouldn't normally vote, might not have a strong partisan preference. And the third, I would say, is all this bleed that we're getting from especially from the north, all these negative, very partisan ads, very designed for the voters of New Hampshire, but could affect how people's frame of mind or their willingness to show up to vote in November. Of those 3 things, I'd be interested, which is most likely to move the needle in Massachusetts, and in which direction?
If I had to guess, there have been some political science studies showing that spillover advertising effects do nudge turnout. So that, like, if you have advertising across the state lines like that, there is a turnout effect. I'm not sure if that is just in presidential elections, but I think it's plausible that turnout where the New Hampshire advertising is penetrating could be slightly higher, which could benefit one candidate or the other. And there might be localized. I think like the most salient ballot issue at a localized level is the casino question. I think, for example, in Springfield, that would be an important question, and in certain other localities that may, that might mean jobs, which is, one of the big issues. That could drive turnout in a more sort of constrained geographical area. I don't know that I don't think it's a unique problem that Republicans don't have strong candidates running for other statewide offices, and so I'm not sure that I think, it's easier to model turnout when it's like turnout the last time, and it's harder when it's different. And so like that I think is less of an issue, because I think it's somewhat predictable, but the ballot issue thing could nudge things a little bit, and the advertising spillover could as well.
Let me just make one comment on that.
Up in Maine, there is one interesting issue on the ballot there. It's a bear baiting issue to ban the use of dogs and bait and traps for hunting bears. And there's quite a bit of speculation that may drive turnout up and help Paul LePage, who's running, because those old blue-collar hunters up in the hills of Maine might not ever vote in an election before, but they'll come out and vote so they can continue to hunt, and they'll probably vote for LePage if they do.
There were similar issues in other states outside of the region with minimum wage ballot initiatives, marijuana legalization ballot initiatives. I know in 2004, the same-sex marriage initiatives were thought to be designed to drive Republican turnout. I think there was pretty persuasive research that didn't actually happen. So it will be interesting to see how things turn out. So I'd like to thank everybody, and Steve.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
And keep an eye on Midterms on our website and Twitter account. We'll keep you up to date on future events. Again, thank you very much for coming.